The moment I remember most clearly isn't the speech itself. It's the 2 seconds right before it ended. When I looked across the auditorium at the faces of soldiers I had served alongside for nearly a decade, and I understood, fully and finally, that the man at that podium had never once seen me. He didn't know. None of them did, because 40 minutes later, a man in a dark suit was going to walk through that door carrying a leather portfolio. And the documents inside it were going to change what every person in that room thought they knew about who I was. My name is Diane Hargrove. I was 52 years old when I retired from the United States Army, and I had spent 24 years in uniform doing work that most people couldn't name, couldn't explain, and couldn't remember long enough to appreciate. Logistics. The science of getting the right thing to the right place at the right time in the right condition. It's the reason soldiers have ammunition when they need it and food when they don't think they need it and fuel when they've forgotten to ask for it. It's the reason deployments succeed or fall apart. It's the backbone of everything. And for 2 decades, I was very good at it. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, the middle daughter of a family that didn't have much, but organized what it had with military precision long before I ever put on a uniform. My mother worked 2 jobs and still had dinner on the table at 6. My father volunteered at the VFW hall every Saturday. I grew up understanding, without anyone ever saying it directly, that the most important work was often the work that no one acknowledged. You just did it, and you kept doing it. I joined the Army at 22, after finishing a degree in supply chain management at Ohio State. I didn't join because I wanted glory. I joined because the work seemed real and the structure suited the way my mind worked. Numbers, systems, dependencies, contingencies. I thrived in environments where the stakes were high and the variables were manageable if you planned carefully enough. I was stationed at a dozen different installations over the course of my career. I served in support roles during operations in Kuwait and Iraq. I managed logistics for a division-level exercise in Germany that was considered one of the most efficiently run in NATO history that year, though the officer who received the commendation for it was not me. I built systems at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, that were still in use 6 years after I implemented them, though you wouldn't find my name attached to them in any official record. That was the nature of the work. That was the nature of most careers in logistics. You succeeded by making your absence invisible, by building things that ran so smoothly that no one noticed them running. I don't say any of that with bitterness. I say it because it's accurate, and because understanding that truth was eventually what made me into something I never expected to be. My husband Thomas died 8 years before I retired. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by the following April. He was 50 years old. We had been married for 21 years, and in that time, he was the person who understood most clearly what I was actually doing when I went to work each morning. He had spent his career in private sector supply chain consulting, and we used to sit at our kitchen table in the evenings and talk about inefficiencies in military procurement with the same enthusiasm other couples reserved for vacation planning. We were genuinely, perhaps embarrassingly, absorbed by the subject. The idea that became Hargrove Integrated Logistics started at that kitchen table, about 4 years before Thomas got sick. We had identified a gap, a serious, expensive, consequential gap, in the way the Army managed its third-party logistics relationships. The contracting systems were outdated. The vendor relationships were mismanaged. The tracking infrastructure was 2 generations behind what private industry was doing. We believed, and we were right, that a company with the right expertise and the right technology could do significantly better at significantly lower cost. We incorporated HIL in Virginia when our daughter Mia was finishing high school. We brought in 2 partners, old colleagues of Thomas's from the consulting world, and we began quietly building the infrastructure for what we intended to be a serious government contracting firm. I retained majority ownership through a trust. Thomas ran the company day to day. I provided the expertise, the institutional knowledge, the relationships, the insider understanding of exactly what the Army needed and exactly what it was getting wrong. When Thomas died, I faced a choice that I don't think many people would have made the same way. The company was small but growing. We had 2 government contracts, a staff of 14, and a reputation in the procurement community that was just beginning to build momentum. I could have sold my stake and walked away, Every rational voice around me said that was the reasonable option. A full-time Army officer couldn't run a defense contractor. The ethics regulations alone would have been prohibitive if anyone had known. But the company had been Thomas's life for 3 years. It was the thing he was most proud of outside our family. It was the vehicle for an idea he genuinely believed in, and he had been right to believe in it. I couldn't let it go. So I didn't. I promoted Janet Mercer, our operations director, to COO and gave her the authority to run the company entirely on a day-to-day basis. I restructured my ownership through a trust that kept my name off the public-facing documents. I consulted by phone, by email, through proxies when necessary. I was meticulous about the ethics walls that had to exist between my service and my private interests. My JAG officer reviewed the arrangement. It passed, and then I watched HIL grow. Over the next 6 years, Hargrove Integrated Logistics became one of the most respected mid-size defense logistics contractors in the country. Janet was exceptional, better, in many ways, than Thomas or I had imagined when we promoted her. She hired the right people, built the right technology platforms, and won the right contracts at the right time. By the time I was approaching retirement, HIL had over 300 employees, contracts with multiple branches of the military, and a valuation that I still found somewhat difficult to reconcile with the company that had started at my kitchen table. The Caldwell contract was the one that changed the scale entirely. It was a Department of Defense Logistics Support contract, 5 years, $1,800 million, covering supply chain operations for Army installations across the Southeast, including Fort Campbell. The RFP process had taken nearly a year. Janet led the bid personally. I provided strategic input from a careful distance. When the award came through, I was sitting in my office at Fort Campbell reviewing quarterly readiness reports, and my phone buzzed with a text from Janet that said simply, "It's ours." I sat with that for a while, then I went back to the readiness reports. What I did not know at the time, and what I found almost remarkable later, was that Brigadier General Marcus Tate, my commanding officer, the man whose division I had served under for the past 3 years, had been one of the internal advocates for awarding the Caldwell contract to HIL. He had reviewed the bids personally and had pushed for HIL's proposal in meetings I was not part of because HIL's reputation was that good. He had helped award a billion-dollar contract to a company whose majority owner was the logistics officer sitting 2 offices down from his. He had no idea. I want to describe Marcus Tate carefully because I don't want to make him into a villain he wasn't, exactly. He wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't corrupt, at least not in any illegal sense. He was the kind of officer who had built his career on being commanding in a room, the kind of presence that made junior officers straighten their spines without being told. He was genuinely skilled at the strategic and operational dimensions of command. He was not, however, skilled at seeing the people around him who didn't look the way he expected effective soldiers to look. I was a woman in my late 40s, working in logistics with a quiet manner and a preference for direct communication over performance. I didn't command rooms, I commanded systems. And in the 3 years I served under Tate, I understood fairly early that he categorized me as competent but unremarkable, good enough, dependable, the kind of officer you don't worry about because she handles her work without drama and doesn't ask for much. That categorization cost me at least 1 promotion I can document directly. When I was evaluated for a position that had opened up in the spring of 2019, Tate's written assessment of me used phrases like steady contributor and reliable under pressure and performs consistently within expectations. These were not criticisms, technically, but they were the language of someone describing the institutional equivalent of a comfortable chair, useful, quiet, not going anywhere interesting. The position went to someone else. I filed that assessment away, not for revenge, just as information. The retirement ceremony was held in the Fort Campbell Auditorium on a Thursday morning in October. My daughter Mia drove up from Nashville the night before, and we had dinner at a quiet Italian place off post, where we ate the same thing we always ordered and talked about her job and her apartment and the small routines of her life in a way that felt, for a few hours, entirely separate from everything that was happening the next morning. That dinner was important to me. It still is when I think about it. The auditorium was full. I had been at Fort Campbell for 3 years, And over the course of a 24-year career, you accumulate people who remember you from different assignments, different deployments, different chapters of a life that gets lived in fragments spread across many places. There were officers and enlisted soldiers I hadn't seen in years. There were people who had worked directly for me, and people I had worked for, and a few people I had never gotten along with particularly well, but who showed up anyway because that's the culture. You show up. Mia sat in the third row. She was wearing a dark blue dress and her father's watch on her wrist, and when our eyes met before the ceremony started, she gave me a small nod that meant what it always meant between us, that she was there, and that she was proud, and that we would talk about it later. The ceremony was standard. Speeches, a citation read aloud, the presentation of the flag. I had attended dozens of these over the years, and the format was familiar in the way that any ritual becomes familiar, each element carrying weight not because of its novelty, but because of its repetition. The way a thing done the same way enough times becomes a kind of anchor. Tate's speech came near the end. He was the senior officer present, and it was his role to offer the farewell address on behalf of the division. I had not read it in advance. Some commanders share their remarks beforehand. He didn't. He began warmly enough. He acknowledged my years of service, my deployments, my tour in Kuwait. He mentioned specific operations by name, which I appreciated. He said I was a professional's professional, which is a phrase I had heard used at other retirements and which communicates competence without exactly communicating distinction. Then he found his stride. He said that logistics was the kind of work that kept the lights on, even when nobody noticed who was flipping the switch. He said it with a kind of affectionate condescension that I recognized immediately, the voice of someone explaining to a general audience why a humble job still has value. He said I had dedicated my career to making sure soldiers had what they needed, and that even if that work didn't make headlines, it made missions possible. He paused there. The pause had the shape of a compliment, but the content of a dismissal. He said he hoped I would enjoy a well-earned, quiet retirement. Quiet. It wasn't a cruel word. It wasn't even, I think, a consciously diminishing word. It was simply the word of someone who had decided, at some point without examining the decision, that my life had been small and would remain small, and that the kindest thing he could offer me was permission to rest from it. I stood in my dress uniform and looked at him and did not move. My hands were still. My expression was neutral. I had spent 24 years learning to keep my face from telling the room what my mind was doing, and I employed that training without effort. Mia told me later that she had gripped the armrest of her seat during that pause. She had not heard the word quiet and thought of rest. She had heard it and thought of erasure. She knew me well enough to know the difference, and she sat very still until it was over. The reception that followed was in the adjoining hall, tables of food, and the kind of institutional coffee that tastes the same at every military installation in the country. I moved through the room shaking hands and accepting congratulations, and the interactions were warm in the way that large institutional gatherings are warm, genuine in individual moments, familiar across the whole. I had been in the reception for about 40 minutes when the door opened. He came in with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been trained to locate a specific person in a crowd without looking like he was searching. A man in his mid-30s, in a dark suit, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. His eyes moved across the room and then landed on me. He made his way through the crowd and extended his hand and said, "Colonel Hargrove, I'm Stephen Aldridge from the Office of the Secretary of Defense." He said it quietly, not for the room, just for me. "I apologize for the timing. I wanted to catch you before the day was over." I shook his hand. "Of course, what can I do for you?" He opened the portfolio and withdrew a set of documents. "We've been coordinating with your team at HIL on the advisory panel appointment," he said. "There are a few items in the consulting agreement that needed your personal review and signature before we can proceed to announcement. Ms. Mercer felt it was more appropriate for you to handle these directly, given the transition." He handed me the documents. I looked at them. They were exactly what Janet had described in our last call: the formalized agreement for my appointment to the Department of Defense's Military Logistics Modernization Advisory Panel, a senior civilian advisory role, appointed through the Secretary's O.F. Vice. My full legal name appeared at the top. The company's name appeared in the second paragraph, along with the contract valuation and the scope of the advisory relationship. I said, "Thank you. I'll review these tonight and have them back to your office by Friday." He said, "Perfect. And congratulations on your retirement, Colonel. The secretary is looking forward to working with you." He said it without ceremony. Then he gave a small nod and began making his way back toward the door. I became aware, at some point during this exchange, that Marcus Tate had moved closer. Not obviously. He had simply drifted toward anything that seemed important, the way senior officers sometimes do. The gravitational pull of rank toward information. He said, "Diane, everything all right?" I looked at him. I considered briefly how to answer. I said, "Everything's fine. An administrative matter." He nodded, glancing at the documents in my hand. His eyes caught the official letterhead, the seal of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and I watched him process it. "White House business," he said, "at a retirement ceremony." "Department of Defense," I said, "not quite the White House, but yes." "What's this about?" "A consulting appointment." He waited. I didn't offer more. He looked at the top document again, and I watched his eyes move to the second line, to the name Hargrove Integrated Logistics, to the valuation figure beside it. He looked at me. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I said, "Excuse me, I need to speak with my daughter." I walked across the room to where Mia was standing with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and when I reached her, she looked at me with an expression that asked several questions at once. I said quietly, "Let's get through the next hour, and then I'll explain everything." She said, "Was that who I think it was?" I said, "Probably." She said, "And those papers?" I said, "Probably what you think they are." She looked across the room to where Tate was still standing, holding a coffee cup he didn't appear to be drinking from. Then she looked back at me. She said, "Mom." I said, "I know." We got through the next hour. I want to be careful here about what I am saying and what I am not saying. What happened that afternoon was not revenge. I hadn't planned for Stephen Aldridge to arrive during the reception. I hadn't arranged the timing. I hadn't anticipated that Tate would be standing close enough to see what was on those documents. None of those things were my doing. What was my doing was everything that came before. The years of building. The trust, the company, the relationships with Janet, the technology infrastructure, the reputation that had earned the Caldwell contract, and eventually the advisory panel appointment. That was mine. Thomas and I had built it together, and after he was gone, I had continued building it, not for the purpose of any single moment, but because it was the right work and it was worth doing. The months that followed my retirement were, in some ways, the most professionally active of my life. The advisory panel met quarterly in Washington, and between sessions there was a significant amount of work: written recommendations, briefings, consultations with procurement officials who, I noticed, now returned calls within hours rather than days. I moved permanently to Columbus, into a house near my mother's assisted living facility, and I established a routine that felt, for the first time in decades, entirely of my own design. Mia visited frequently. We had the kitchen conversations we had always had, but now there was more time for them, and they went deeper. She asked about Thomas, about what he had been like in the years when HIL was just an idea, when it was just two people at a table convinced they were right about something nobody else had noticed yet. I told her things I hadn't told her before, not because I had been hiding them, but because some things take time to put into language. She asked me once why I had kept the company private during my service, whether it had been difficult to watch HIL grow without being able to acknowledge it. I thought about that before I answered. I said it had been difficult sometimes, but I had also understood, clearly and early, that if my ownership had been public, the work would have become about the conflict, about the optics of a serving officer owning a defense contractor, rather than about the company itself. The company needed to be evaluated on its merits. So did I keeping them separate had been the right decision, even when it was uncomfortable? She asked whether I thought the people who had underestimated me would have treated me differently if they had known. I said, honestly, that I wasn't sure it mattered. What mattered was that the work was good. 6 months after my retirement, a Department of Defense inspector, general audit of Fort Campbell's procurement records, identified a series of irregularities in contracting decisions made under Tate's oversight. I want to be precise. The irregularities had nothing to do with me or with HIL. They concerned a different contractor entirely and a pattern of decisions in Tate's division that the audit characterized as showing a preference for certain vendors that could not be justified by cost or performance data. The investigation took several months. It resulted in referrals, reviews, and ultimately in Tate submitting his retirement paperwork the following spring. I found out through a former colleague who called to tell me the way people do when they know you've been watching a situation from a distance. I thanked her for letting me know. I sat with the information for a long time. I did not feel what you might expect me to feel. Not satisfaction, exactly. What I felt was something more like the particular sadness that comes when you realize a person's worst qualities were their own undoing all along, and that there was nothing anyone could have done to produce a different outcome. Tate had never been a bad soldier in the fundamental sense. He had served, led, made decisions under pressure. But he had also allowed the certainty of his own judgment to become a kind of blindness. He saw what he expected to see. He valued what was easy to value. And those habits accumulated their own consequences, completely independent of anything I had built or decided or done. I think about that sometimes, about the difference between the mistakes people make because of their worst impulses and the mistakes they make because of the assumptions they never thought to question. Tate's assessment of me had been the second kind. He had never decided I was unworthy. He had simply never decided I was worth examining more carefully. That distinction doesn't make it hurt less, but it does make it more understandable. The advisory panel work extended into its third year before I stepped back from the formal role. By then, several of my core recommendations had been adopted into Department of Defense procurement policy, changes to how third-party logistics contracts were evaluated, new transparency requirements for vendor relationships, updated technology standards that had been long overdue. The work was less visible than a deployment ribbon and harder to explain at a gathering. But it was real, it mattered, and it had my fingerprints on it even when most people didn't know whose they were. HIL continued to grow under Janet's leadership. I remained the majority owner through the trust, but my involvement had been minimal for years. In the fourth year after retirement, I formally reduced my stake in the company, a decision I made for reasons that had more to do with Thomas than with business strategy. Janet and her team had built something that didn't need me the way it once had. That was exactly as it should be. Mia is married now, to a good man who teaches high school history in Nashville and thinks carefully about most things and makes her laugh in a way that I am grateful to have watched. They came to Columbus for Thanksgiving, and we sat at a table that was too large for 3 people and ate too much food. And at some point, the conversation turned to careers and purpose and what it means to build something that lasts. Mia's husband asked me how I had known, back when Thomas and I were at the kitchen table with an idea and a legal pad, that it was going to become what it became. I said I hadn't known. He said, then why keep going? I thought about Thomas, about the way he used to explain the gap in the contracting system to anyone who would listen, with the particular energy of someone who has identified a problem so clearly that they can't understand why everyone else hasn't already fixed it. About the morning I sat in my office at Fort Campbell, and my phone buzzed with a text from Janet that said it's ours, and I thought of him before I thought of anything else. I said, you keep going because the work is real. And real work has a way of mattering eventually, even when the people around you haven't figured out yet what they're looking at. Mia's husband nodded slowly and said that was a good answer. I said it had taken me a while to arrive at it. What I didn't say, because it would have taken too long to explain at a holiday table, was that the most important thing I had learned across 24 years of military service and 8 years of building a company in careful silence. The most important thing was this. The people who dismiss you have already told you something valuable. They've told you that they're not looking. And when people aren't looking, you can build almost anything. I still do some consulting work, selectively, on logistics and procurement questions I find genuinely interesting. I still talk to Janet several times a month, more personal now than professional, though the line was always blurry between us. I still have dinner with Mia on visits, and we still talk about Oma's the way you talk about someone who isn't gone so much as located somewhere you'll reach eventually. My mother is 91. She keeps a calendar on the wall of her room at the assisted living facility, and every Saturday she marks whether I visited. She gives me a look when I miss one that communicates volumes without a single word. Some things about a person are fully formed long before adulthood, and I understand now that the way I keep things running without fanfare, the way I plan 3 steps ahead and say less than I think and value the quality of the work over the recognition that comes with it, all of that came from her kitchen, 30 years before I ever set foot on an army base. She has never asked me much about the company. She knows it exists. She knows it did well. Once, about 2 years after I retired, she asked if Thomas would have been proud. I said yes, I believed that completely. She said good, and looked back at her calendar. I think about that Thursday morning at Fort Campbell sometimes. The auditorium, the folding chairs, the ceremonial elements assembled to mark the end of something. I think about standing in my dress uniform, listening to a man describe my career as quiet and unremarkable, and I think about how completely he was both right and wrong. My life had been quiet. I had worked hard to make it that way. Quiet was a strategy, not a limitation. Quiet was the thing that had made everything else possible, the space within which a company grew from a kitchen table conversation into something that reshaped how the Army managed its supply chain, mostly invisible to the people who might have complicated the process if they had known. He was wrong about the unremarkable part. But I don't need him to know that. I never did. The work was always for something larger than his opinion of it, and the proof of that work is not measured in his recognition. It's measured in the logistics systems still running at installations he's never visited, in the procurement policies that carry my influence without my name, in the contracts that kept soldiers supplied, and missions on schedule for years after I wasn't there to manage them directly. That's what I built. That's what Thomas and I started building one evening at a kitchen table in a house in Kentucky because we saw a problem and believed it was worth solving. If I could go back to that retirement ceremony and change only one thing, it would be this. When Tate let the word quiet settle into the room like a verdict, I would let myself smile, just barely, just for a second, instead of keeping my face completely still. Not for anyone else to see, just for me. Because I already knew what was on those documents, and it was not quiet at all.